March 9, 1974. Lubang Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda crouched in the jungle darkness, his rifle raised, watching a young Japanese man walk toward him through the trees. The stranger wore civilian clothes and carried no weapon, only a camera and what appeared to be photographs. 29 years of combat had taught Onoda to recognize every type of trap, every variety of deception. This was clearly enemy psychological warfare. But something made him hesitate. The young man stopped 30 feet away, hands visible, and called out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, the war is over. I have proof." Onoda's finger stayed on the trigger. He'd heard this lie 1,000 times before. By 1945, World War II had consumed 70 to 85 million lives, roughly 3% of the entire world's population. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the vast machinery of global conflict ground to a halt. Armies demobilized, prisoners came home. The guns fell silent. Except they didn't. Not everywhere. Across the scattered islands of the Pacific, small units of Japanese soldiers remained at their posts, convinced the surrender announcements were Allied propaganda. Some emerged after months, others after years. But a handful, the true believers, the perfectly conditioned warriors, continued fighting a war that no longer existed. The strategic problem was unprecedented. The Pacific theater had sprawled across 64 million square miles of ocean, encompassing thousands of islands, many barely mapped. Japanese forces had dug into volcanic caves, dense jungles, and remote atolls specifically chosen for their defensive advantages. When the war ended, nobody knew exactly where every unit was stationed. Allied command issued leaflets. They broadcast surrender messages. They sent search parties into the jungle. Most soldiers emerged within months, emaciated and relieved. But the psychological conditioning of Imperial Japanese Army training created a different category of fighter entirely men, who had been taught that surrender meant eternal dishonor, that captured leaflets were fabrications, that any message contradicting their orders was enemy deception. The scattered holdouts became known as the stragglers, Zonri Nipponhai. For years, then decades, they remained at war, alone, forgotten, waiting for orders that would never come. The question wasn't just how to find them. The question was how to convince a soldier who had endured years of isolation, who had resisted every attempt at psychological warfare, who had survived on pure discipline and belief. How do you convince him that everything he's fighting for has already ended? Hiroo Onoda wasn't supposed to become a legend. He was supposed to die. Born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, Onoda grew up in a Japan rapidly militarizing for total war. There was nothing exceptional about his childhood middle-class family, unremarkable student, conventional patriotic upbringing. At 18, he was conscripted. At 20, while working as a clerk at a trading company in China, he was recalled for officer training. This is where his life diverged. Onoda was selected for Futomotatha Imperial Japanese Army Intelligence School. Not because of any particular brilliance, but because of something the instructors noticed, an almost pathological inability to give up. Where other trainees broke under interrogation exercises, Onoda endured. Where others abandoned impossible navigation problems, Onoda kept calculating. It wasn't genius. It was something more fundamentaler, metabolic resistance to surrender, that couldn't be trained, only identified. The curriculum at Futomata was designed to create a specific type of soldier, guerrilla fighters who could operate independently behind enemy lines for months or years. They learned survival skills, but more importantly, they learned psychological resistance. Every lesson reinforced one central doctrine: orders are absolute. Command is sacred. Surrender is worse than death. Your mission continues until you receive explicit orders to stop, delivered in person by a superior officer. No written message, no radio broadcast. Only a living superior officer could release you from duty. In December 1944, Onoda received his assignment, Lubang Island, 75 miles southwest of Manila. His mission was brutally simple conduct, guerrilla warfare. Gather intelligence, and under no circumstances allow yourself to be captured. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Toneguchi, delivered the orders personally. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Onoda was 22 years old. He arrived on Lubang on December 26, 1944, with 200 other soldiers. Within 4 months, American forces invaded. The Japanese garrison was decimated. By September 1945, when leaflets announcing Japan's surrender began raining from the sky, only a handful of Onoda's unit remained alive. The other soldiers read the leaflets and debated. Some wanted to surrender. The evidence seemed overwhelming: photographs of MacArthur accepting surrender, testimonies from Japanese officers, official imperial seals on documents. Onoda examined the same evidence and saw something different. He saw exactly what his training had taught him to see: sophisticated enemy propaganda designed to make him abandon his post. The photographs could be faked. The testimonies could be coerced. The seals could be forged. But his orders had been delivered in person by Major Toneguchi, and only Major Toneguchi in person could rescind them. So while the others wavered, Onoda made his decision. He would continue the mission. The breakthrough, if you can call it, that came from Onoda's absolute fidelity to a simple principle: observe reality, not assumptions. Most soldiers who surrendered did so because they trusted institutional authority over their own perception. A leaflet bearing an official seal carried inherent credibility. A radio broadcast in the emperor's voice seemed irrefutable. The weight of accumulated evidence created a probability so overwhelming that doubt seemed insane. But Onoda had been trained to operate in an environment where every piece of information might be weaponized deception. His survival depended on trusting nothing except direct orders from verified superior officers. This wasn't paranoia, it was doctrine. A set of evaluation criteria that rejected probabilistic reasoning in favor of absolute verification. When locals tried to approach his jungle camps with peace offerings, he saw reconnaissance. When Filipino police tried to negotiate, he saw psychological operations. When Japanese search parties called his name through the jungle, he heard voice mimicry perfected by enemy intelligence. His 3 companions, Corporal Shimada, Private Kozuka, and Private Akotsa, followed his lead initially. They established a routine that would persist for decades: move constantly. Never stay in one camp more than 2 nights. Gather intelligence on enemy movements, actually local farmers and police. Conduct sabotage operations, burning rice stores, cutting communication lines. Stay ready for the main invasion force to return. Akatsu surrendered in 1950, unable to endure the isolation. Onoda watched him walk toward Filipino police and felt something close to pity. The man had been broken. Shimada was killed in a firefight with search parties in 1954. Onoda buried him in the jungle and continued the mission with Kozuka. For the next 18 years, it was just the 2 of them, moving through the mountains of Lubang, conducting reconnaissance, avoiding capture, waiting. The Philippine government sent search parties every few years. They found campsites, occasionally exchanged fire, sometimes left messages. Onoda ignored them all. In 1972, Kozuka was shot and killed by Philippine police during a raid on a rice granary. Onoda buried his last companion and continued alone. At 50 years old, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda became the last soldier of World War II, still actively engaged in combat operations. If you're finding this story as compelling as we did, hit that subscribe button. There are dozens more untold stories like this waiting to be discovered. The numbers became staggering. By 1974, Onoda had spent 10,585 days in combat. He had conducted an estimated 100 raids against what he believed were enemy installations burning crops, cutting telephone lines, exchanging fire with local police. He had killed or wounded an estimated 30 people, all Filipino civilians or police officers who he believed were enemy combatants or collaborators. The Japanese government had declared him legally dead in 1959. His family held a funeral. His name was engraved on the war memorial. The world moved on. But the Philippine government couldn't move on. Every few years, someone on Lubang would report seeing the lone Japanese soldier. Rice stores would burn. Communication lines would be severed. The raids were becoming more sophisticated, not less. Onoda was adapting, learning, becoming more effective at guerrilla warfare 3 decades after the war ended. President Ferdinand Marcos faced an increasingly absurd political problem. How do you explain to your citizens that a single holdout from a war that ended before most of them were born is still conducting military operations in your territory? How do you explain that decades of search efforts have failed to capture or convince one man? The Japanese government mounted expedition after expedition. Family members traveled to Lubang, stood in the jungle calling Onoda's name, pleading for him to come home. His brothers, his childhood friends, his former colleagues all made the journey. All failed. Onoda watched from concealment, listened to voices he recognized, and stayed hidden. The enemy had gotten better at voice imitation. The psychological warfare was becoming more sophisticated. But his orders remained unchanged. Continue the mission until relieved by a superior officer. In 1972, another search party found one of Kozuka's campsites. Inside, they discovered something that made the situation clear. Carefully maintained equipment, detailed maps of the island, updated with recent intelligence, ammunition stores organized for long-term operations. This wasn't a confused holdout waiting for rescue. This was an active intelligence officer conducting ongoing military operations with textbook precision. The Philippine military considered mounting an all-out assault to force capture. But the political optics were nightmarish, ploying a battalion against a single middle-aged man who believed he was following orders. The Japanese government considered every diplomatic option. Psychiatrists analyzed his psychology from a distance. Anthropologists studied the reports, trying to understand what kind of belief system could sustain this level of isolation. Nobody could solve the problem because everyone was thinking like a modern person trying to convince someone from a different era, operating under a different set of axioms entirely. Onoda didn't reject their evidence because he was irrational. He rejected it because his decision-making framework had different foundational premises. Then, in February 1974, a 24-year-old Japanese college dropout named Norio Suzuki decided to do something nobody else had tried. Not capture Onoda, not convince him, but simply find him and talk to him. Suzuki had dropped out of university to find a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Onoda in that order. He was an adventurer, not a soldier. He had no official backing, no psychological training, no tactical expertise. He simply read everything available about Onoda's patterns, hiked into the Lubang jungle with camping gear and a camera, and waited. On February 20, 1974, Suzuki encountered Onoda at a jungle campsite. Instead of trying to convince him the war was over, Suzuki asked him about his mission, his tactics, his life. He listened, he photographed. He treated Onoda not as a curiosity or a problem to solve, but as a soldier still serving. After several meetings, Suzuki asked, "What would it take for you to surrender?" Onoda's answer was immediate. "Orders from my commanding officer." Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs proving Onoda was alive and his exact condition for ending his war. The Japanese government faced a new problem. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's commanding officer, had retired from the military decades ago and was living quietly as a civilian bookstore owner. But Taniguchi agreed to return to duty one final time. March 9, 1974. Major Taniguchi, now 60 years old, wearing his old Imperial Army uniform retrieved from storage, stood in a clearing on Lubang Island. Philippine President Marcos had agreed to grant immunity for all actions Onoda had taken during his decades-long war. The media was kept at a distance. This was between a commanding officer and his subordinate. Norio Suzuki brought Onoda to the meeting point. Onoda approached with his rifle, in full uniform he had maintained for 29 years, still technically on combat patrol. Taniguchi saluted. Onoda returned the salute, precise and formal. "Lieutenant Onoda," Taniguchi said, his voice steady. "I am relieving you of your duties." He read the orders officially. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The emperor had commanded all forces to cease hostilities. The order Onoda had been following for nearly 3 decades was now countermanded by imperial decree, delivered by his direct commanding officer. Onoda stood at attention, absorbing the information. For the first time in 10,622 days, the framework that had structured his entire reality shifted. The mission was complete, not abandoned, not surrendered, complete. He unbuckled his refuller, 7.7mm Arasaka type, 99 still in working condition, and formally surrendered it, along with 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, and his ceremonial sword. He handed over meticulously maintained maps of Lubang, detailed intelligence reports, and his diary documenting nearly 3 decades of operations. When Philippine officials took custody of his equipment, they found it all still functional. His rifle was clean, oiled, ready for combat. His maps were current. His reports were organized chronologically. This wasn't the confused documentation of a delusional holdout. This was the professional work product of an intelligence officer who had spent 29 years executing his mission with absolute fidelity. The cost of such perfect obedience was almost impossible to comprehend. Onoda was 52 years old when he finally came home. He had been 22 when he arrived on Lubang. He had spent more than half his life at war, the majority of it after the war ended. The Japan he returned to was incomprehensibly a modern democracy, economically prosperous, culturally transformed. The emperor he had served with religious devotion was now a ceremonial figurehead. The military values that had defined his identity were considered relics of a discredited past. His return created a media sensation. Some called him a hero, the ultimate embodiment of loyalty and duty. Others called him a tragedia man, whose life had been stolen by obsolete ideology. The families of the 30 Filipinos killed during his decades-long war called for justice. The Philippine government's immunity agreement prevented prosecution, but couldn't prevent the questions. How do you honor someone's dedication while acknowledging the harm caused by that dedication? Onoda struggled profoundly to adapt. The modern world felt chaotic, random, undisciplined. People changed jobs, broke commitments, abandoned responsibilities. The values he had considered absolutely hierarchy, completion of duties seemed quaint or dangerous depending on who you asked. He gave lectures, wrote a memoir, appeared on television. He said what people wanted to hear about duty and perseverance. But in quieter moments, he spoke about what those 29 years had actually cost. The psychological weight of perfect vigilance, maintained for 3 decades. The loneliness that didn't end when the isolation did, because nobody could actually understand what it meant to be that committed to anything. The strange guilt of having survived when Shimada and Kozuka died, of having followed orders so precisely that he became a prisoner of them. In 1975, he used his small savings and media payment to move to Brazil, where he bought a cattle ranch and essentially disappeared again, not into jungle warfare, but into rural isolation where the value systems were simpler and the questions didn't follow him. He married, raised cattle, taught occasional survival courses. He rarely discussed his war years. In 1984, he returned to Luba not for media attention, but to establish a scholarship fund for local education, a quiet acknowledgement that his war had hurt real people who deserved something better than his fidelity to extinct orders. He lived until 2014, dying at 91. His obituaries struggled to categorize him: hero or victim, symbol of loyalty or cautionary tale, the ultimate soldier or the ultimate fool. The final accounting force's uncomfortable mathematics. At the time of Onoda's surrender, military historians estimated there had been approximately 50 to 100 Japanese holdouts scattered across the Pacific Islands. Most had surrendered or been killed by 1956. A few persistent cases lasted into the 1960s. But Onoda was different, not the last to be found, but the last to maintain full combat operations, to continue actively fighting a war that had ended 3 decades prior. His story became a parable, but nobody could agree on its lesson. Some saw the danger of absolute obedience to authority. Some saw the tragedy of soldiers abandoned by the states they served. Some saw an indictment of the psychological conditioning that could transform a normal person into someone incapable of accepting changed reality. But there's another reading, more uncomfortable and more universal. Onoda's war didn't last 29 years because he was delusional. It lasted 29 years because his belief system was internally consistent. His evaluation criteria were logical within their axioms, and his commitment was total. He wasn't refusing to see evidence. He was seeing evidence through a framework that classified all contradictory information as enemy deception. We like to think we're different, that we'd recognize when our foundational assumptions become obsolete, when our core missions no longer serve their intended purpose, when it's time to stop fighting battles that the rest of the world has moved past. But every year, people continue wars that have already ended, political conflicts long since resolved but never acknowledged, personal grievances maintained with religious precision, professional competitions in fields that no longer exist, relationships fought over long after everyone else has moved on. The question Onoda's life poses isn't how could someone fight for 29 years after a war ended. The question is, how many years into your own obsolete war are you right now? Onoda followed orders until properly relieved of them. Most of us never receive that clear order to stop. We have to recognize for ourselves when the war is over, when the mission has changed, when fidelity to the original objective has become its own form of imprisonment. The discipline to continue is easy to romanticize. The wisdom to stop is considerably harder to achieve. The official records show that Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda served from 1942 to 1974, a 32-year military career. But that framing misses the truth. He didn't serve for 32 years. He served until someone with authority told him he could stop. How many of us would recognize that moment without someone in uniform telling us directly? How many of us already missed it? This is why we do this: two rescue stories that force us to examine our own assumptions. If you want more forgotten histories, more impossible commitments, more proof that human conviction can outlast empires, subscribe now, and drop a comment below. What personal war have you been fighting past its end date? Your voice shapes what we uncover next, and this community, spanning from Tokyo to Toronto, from veterans to students, is built on honest reflection, not comfortable myths.